Hello, and thank you for listening to Rivers of the Mind. My name is Timmy Vilgiate, the writer and producer of Rivers of the Mind, a co-production of the Deep State Psy-War Invisible Television Company and UCCS Radio. Before we begin, I'd like to make it clear that Rivers of the Mind is not meant to promote the use of LSD, scopolamine, or any interest in owning a rowboat. Everything in this series is fictional, including the existence of rowboats themselves. Rowboats? What a ridiculous idea. Get these foolish ideas of rowboats out of your head. Elements of this series may be disturbing for some listeners. Rivers of the Mind features Timmy Vilgiate, me as John, as well as CJ Hackett as Ryan and the Fisherman. Now, with all that said, here is Season 2, Episode 4 of Rivers of the Mind, entitled Up, Down, Up, Down.
Down, down, up, up, down, down, up, down, 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 up, down, down, down,
down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. The oars rose and sunk rhythmically into the water as the fisherman sat behind me, tearing bits of bread and scattering them into the river. Up, down, up, down. We inched along the river, a tremendous expanse with a surface like a glass eye. My arms and shoulders ached. I did not know how long I had been rowing for. It seemed like it had been daytime for an eternity. Up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. I winced, in fear of the fisherman's net that it would again bear down on my back, but he did not move. The bread ceased to drop from between his weathered fingers, and the air ceased to move around the bread that was already falling, and the sunlight ceased to burn the bread that now floated in the river. I stood up. My name. I remembered it. My name was John. A mouth and eyes tore openings from the sunken, skinned-over pits in my skull. Memories flooded back into my brain, and I looked up at the sky. The inside of my own head suddenly awash with colors and voices. My own voices. How long had I been here for? It must have been months, years, even longer. I remembered my memories used as playthings. each one taken and handed back to me used, so that they no longer smelled or felt or sounded clean and familiar, like if a friend borrows a jacket and forgets to wash it, maybe. And he took them from me. The fisherman. I could remember it all now. Yes, every single piece of it. He torpidly hunched over the water, his body locked in place like the jaw of a rabid dog around the neck of its prey. I felt adrenaline pulse through me as I clutched the oar in my hands and raised it up over my head. He'd taken everything from me. I swung the oar as hard as I could, and I knocked his frozen body out of the boat and onto the water. He bounced and slid absently down a frictionless river. As he slid away, his face turned towards me. Gaping black pits took the place of where his eyes should have been, and a ring of hooked teeth appeared around his mouth. I shuddered in seeing his true form before I managed to avert my attention to more pressing matters. Here I was, alone in an empty, frozen and lifeless world. All around me, night. Beautiful and perfect night had fallen on the river banks, and I was a stranger in my own mind. More than anything, I wanted to get out of here, out of this boat, out of this river, out of my head. My powers came back in full force. I pulled against the spaces between my neurons, hearing them bend and screech like breaking steel. And all of a sudden, I became conscious of the rest of my brain, perceiving myself as an infinitesimal part of it. I knew that somehow, even though he'd been expelled from where I was, there were others like him, others hidden elsewhere inside of my head. And others, just like me, remained trapped in different parts of space and time. Somewhere else in my brain, I knew that the fisherman was still alive, conserving his energy around whichever parts of this invasion he deemed most critical to his ultimate objective. Around those pieces of brain, I perceived a stubborn wall, wrapped tight like a python, suffocating my will to resist. I was hopeless to fight against it, being but one lonely fragment of a personality. And I knew if I rattled on the bars of my cages anymore, I might draw his attention back to my apparently discarded reality. Watching the emptiness above my head, I gently stepped my foot out onto the river. I remembered the countless times that I had been thrown into its surface. Hundreds of them materialized all together in a poison that now pressed against my ears and my veins, drowning out my own heartbeat. As in my imagination, I fell down, and I kept falling and falling and falling, but not this time. I didn't fall this time. I only stood and rested my feet on the water gently. I focused on them. Right, left, right, left, right, left. I carefully crept along the frozen water, which was eerily flat and completely endless. I could hear my footsteps clatter back to me against a wall, which felt incredibly close, yet which never made itself appear to me, hidden beneath the horizon. Left. Right. Left. Right. I continued on. Real life, the place that I hoped I was going, seemed impossibly far away. Like all the memories that I still had of it were just stupid dreams. I knew that I was the person who I thought I was, but I didn't believe it. It was like when I was in kindergarten and a new teacher named Miss Gray, who got hired after the last teacher brought some grown-up drinks to the school. Yeah, that's right. Miss Gray read me a book about dinosaurs. And she told me that right where we were, in California, there were dinosaurs that were taller than the ceiling. I tried to picture it, but I never really could. Even when I grew up and I learned more about dinosaurs, I'd even studied geology and then, learned to harvest their bones to power cities. Even then, when I should have had the concept of dinosaurs grasped with a little bit more, confidence or something, I could never make them real. I just know that they were real once upon a time, and in my mind I could never make them real. And it was just like that. I couldn't make the person that I remembered all that time ago and in the real world real to me again. I felt old, like older than I could have possibly been, as distant from who I knew that I was as I was from the dinosaurs. Old enough that any happiness I remembered became irrelevant, that any sadness I had ever felt was outweighed by the repetition of this psychic prison, that any debts I owed no longer mattered. There was only this intrusion to my mind, this war that had lasted for what felt like an impossibly long time. Left, right, left, right. Walking gave me a certain kind of comfort now. After all, it's half of what I think I remember, and it's the only thing I know for sure I really remember doing. I'd been forced to relive so many of my memories again and again that I didn't know for sure which ones were real. Months had passed, spent reliving the day that I first thought about running away at work, for example. Years passed, doing nothing but falling down into the mouth of a white flower, its petals wrapping themselves around me like a silk blanket until I... Land? Land. I am feeling my feet touch what appears to be land. I'd reached the end of the river. It seemed like it had happened in the blink of an eye, even if, really, looking back, it felt like it took forever. I looked back, and the boat seemed like it was only a few feet away. I knew it wasn't, somehow, intuitively. So perhaps I was walking into another trap. If I was, well, I suppose I didn't have a choice. Dense fog hung between the buildings in a decidedly nondescript town, whose streets were lined with quaint two-story buildings and enveloped on all sides by forest. Frigid, dense air filled my lungs as I stepped up to have a closer look. Cars had stopped in the middle of traffic, with their headlights peering out through the fog. People had frozen in the midst of crossing roads. An old woman in a shop held up her hand to turn off an open sign. A younger boy to the back of her was caught in the middle of a bad sneeze. And all of it felt real. The boat, and the memory of what exactly the boat had even looked like in the first place, both vanished. And the river seemed so tiny now, it was barely even a stream. My footsteps tossed dry echoes against the walls in the city, which quickly became lost in an impenetrable and unreal stillness. Was this another trap? I didn't remember seeing a place like this before, and perhaps that was the best sign of one of his traps. What was more, I knew that these people were real because I could read their minds. Or, really, I could read whatever vowel or consonant or color they were thinking of. They were all real people. Every single one of them was real. I weaved through a family on the sidewalk who had just taken their kids out to get some ice cream, and I inspected their faces with pity and concern. None of their sounds really gave me any idea of where I was, or where I ought to go. Nothing about this place gave me any sense of an answer. Perhaps my tormentor had died. Perhaps my rescue had been overlooked. Or maybe I was just so distant from the real world that a second out there would feel like a million years in here. By the time my rescue had been finished, maybe there wouldn't be anything left of me. But I couldn't dwell on it. Couldn't get my hopes up, that was just what he would have wanted. This town was probably just another trap. And I should know by now I'll never escape into any kind of real world. I kept walking, my head down, but with every muscle in my body ready to jump and run at the slightest sign of danger. A pair of marshy, heavy footsteps in the distance caught my attention. Though I recognized the mind that they belonged to as that of my captor, he didn't seem quite like the fisherman that I remembered. I froze still. The world felt like it was spinning. As the enemy mine grew nearer, shadows fell over the walls of brick buildings and the doors of passing cars. I was torn between running away and hiding. Deluding myself into believing that I had a chance, I chose to hide, or to at least make an attempt at survival, delusion or no delusion. I dove into a nearby alleyway, finding shelter behind a dumpster. His footsteps came closer. perilously closer. For an instant, he came so close that I could catch a glimpse into his thoughts and his memories with no interference or distortion. His name was Ryan. He crept along in a dissociated and delirious haze, himself worn thin from millennia of pain. Though he seemed much different from the fishermen, I could tell that the two of them at least came from the same place if they weren't the same person entirely. I pondered whether or not I should attack him, or maybe even try to speak to him, but I didn't want to do anything foolish. Instead, as he grew further away, I latched onto his mind so that I could track him from a distance. I tried to understand his thoughts. His mind certainly remembered more than I could even fathom. It had seen more time. It had been caught in more loops. It had lingered more years in the same place. There is no bottom or top to his memories, but instead they formed a numinous and infinite space. He walked along stiltedly, with no purpose nor reason entering his mind. Once I was sure that I'd be out of sight, I slid out of the alleyway and hunched down behind a car that was frozen in the process of parking. Ryan shot a glance over his shoulder with bloodshot and paranoid eyes, his enormous pupils darting back and forth in search of an unseen attacker. Stifled as it was by years and years of abuse, I felt a compassion for him. A feeling I thought I'd lost a long time ago. After all, he could have been the only one in the world who had gone through what I'd gone through. I thought back to what the fisherman said. A lonely god, he'd said he was. And indeed, he seemed a lonely god now that I'd seen this other part of him. He was less grandiose, less purposeful. Millions upon billions of years of wandering through time, of witnessing the passage of various histories across an almost boundless multiverse had rendered him too apathetic for sadism. However, as apathetic as he was, that apathy never overcame his fear. He was still afraid, and I understood why. You never get over your first few times dying. Not really. And he died thousands more times than I had. As I followed along, I almost felt a trust grow for him. But I didn't want to feed into it. I couldn't trust him. But it was worth it. At the very least, I figured, to follow him and to see what he did. He moved more and more frantically as he went on, winding through alleys and streets, ever more suspicious that he was being followed by another, younger, and more nefarious version of himself from a different timeline. He let his mind become dominated, almost willfully it seemed, by the remembered image of a blue-gray house, with 2 stories and a fresh-painted white deck. In this memory, a teenager, who looked just like him, sat hunched over a desk adjacent to the window, his eyes glazing over at a sheet of graph paper. A familiar scene. He couldn't remember how many times he'd relived it. He knew that there'd been at least 1,000,000 where he'd tried to attack that foolish, stupid teenager, snipping seed pods off a strange white flower. And he'd even managed to kill himself in more than half of those attempts, only to wind up back in the same spot, remembering everything and forced to start from scratch. This infinitesimal moment that we now entered 11 years in the past was only the fraction of a split second that had gone by since he'd taken the seeds. It would take another 3 days of real time, said the news reports he'd read about his death, for him to die. And by his count, that meant it would take another 400 septillion years for his consciousness to enter death. He always checked his last words in the paper to see what kind of reality he was starting out in. His last words in the obituary changed depending on the timeline. In some of them, he just screamed and begged for it to stop. Others had him boasting through maniacal cackles that he was the devil and that we were all his slaves. In some of them, he whispered some dreamy words about angels, universal peace, castles of light. Once, they said he didn't even say a thing. He just stared, and he stared and stared at the wall till his heart stopped beating. This walk down the city street appeared linear on the surface, but actually took place across thousands of timelines as he dodged attacks, made preparations, and shifted his focus between possible outcomes. The house, he remembered, cowered meekly beneath a half-lit street lamp trapped in the middle of a flicker. The grass died back softly as his feet touched it. Leaves clattered to the ground from the bushes. He gently grasped the doorknob and prepared to turn it with a morose and dried-out despair. But he paused for some reason, like he'd forgotten something.
Well, aren't you going to come in?
He looked over his shoulder.
Come on. You realize I'm doing this on a constant loop, and you didn't figure out I already know you're here? Jeez. He must have really done a number on this version of you, huh?
I emerged from behind the car. Haphazardly, he waved.
Hey.
Hey.
How's it going?
Change a thing as long as you're happy with